The cry of a child in the middle of a snowstorm changed her life forever. But what Brielle Hawkins never expected was that the same cry would also save the life of the most dangerous man in Chicago. Brielle Hawkins, 27 years old, was a night janitor on the 18th floor of Thornton Tower. Every night, her hands, cracked from harsh cleaning chemicals, tightened around the mop handle, her feet throbbed inside worn-down shoes, and her body braced itself for 12 straight hours, just to earn a meager paycheck that was almost never enough to cover the rent of her tiny room. She worked 6 days a week, no holidays off, no insurance, and no one ever asked if she was tired. Each evening she wiped every pane of glass clean, polished every oak desk until it shone, and vacuumed every thick carpet in offices larger than the room she slept in. By day, those desks belonged to people in tailored 3-piece suits, in glossy leather shoes, speaking in numbers that ran to 6 figures and beyond. They left half-finished coffee cups behind, sandwich wrappers tossed beside the trash can instead of inside it, and not once in 3.5 years did any of them look her in the eyes. To them, Brielle did not exist. She was only a ghost gliding down the hallway after they were gone, the invisible hands that kept their glamorous world spotless. She did not resent it. She was used to it. Life had taught her that the poor are invisible, and she had been invisible for 27 years. But tonight would be different. Tonight, in the middle of the most brutal snowstorm of the Chicago winter, Brielle Hawkins would do something no amount of money could buy, and her life would never be the same again. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button to support us. Share this video with the people you love, and if you have not subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now so you will not miss the next deeply moving stories. The clock on the maintenance room wall read 11:30 at night. Outside Thornton Tower, the December snowstorm howled like a wild beast clawing at the city of Chicago. Wind slammed against the building's thick glass. Snow spiraled in blinding white sheets that swallowed the streets, and the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold where anyone left outdoors too long could end up in real danger. Brielle pushed her cleaning cart into the corner of the maintenance room, lined up the chemical bottles neatly, then peeled off her rubber gloves, yellowed with age. Her hands were flushed red, the cracks at her fingertips seeping a faint line of blood, as they did every night. She washed up in cold water because the hot tap in the maintenance room had been broken for 2 months, and no one had bothered to fix it. She took her frayed coat from her locker, the one tiny locker in the entire 40-story building that actually had her name on it. The coat was so thin the wind could cut right through it, but it was the warmest thing she owned. She pulled the zipper up to her throat, wrapped the old wool scarf her mother had knitted in the last year before she died, and stepped out into the hallway. The 18th floor was silent. The offices she had just finished cleaning were now dark, with only the red blink of the fire safety lights on the ceiling. Brielle pressed the elevator button and waited, her back against the wall, her eyes drifting shut. Exhausted. That was the only word that fit what her body felt like right now. 12 hours of standing, bending, kneeling, wiping, scrubbing, pulling, pushing. Her knees ached, her shoulders were rigid, and tomorrow, it would all happen again. At 5 in the morning, her alarm would go off. She would wake up in her 12-square-meter room on the south side, where the ceiling was mottled with mold, and the window never sealed all the way, so the wind slipped in all night long. She would stir the cheapest instant coffee from the supermarket, eat a piece of bread left over from the day before, then walk 4 blocks to the bus stop, 2 buses, 1 transfer in the bitter cold, to reach a lawyer's house in Lincoln Park. There she would mop floors, scrub toilets, wash bed sheets for a woman who paid her $60 a day and had been calling her by the wrong name for 3 months, without ever bothering to correct herself. Then, in the evening, she would take 2 buses back the other way, change clothes, and head to Thornton Tower for the night shift. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the elevator chime yanked her out of her thoughts. The doors opened. She stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator began its descent. 15, 12, 8. Brielle closed her eyes, her head resting against the ice-cold elevator wall. In that brief pocket of quiet, she thought about the people who owned this building. Where were they at this hour? In warm houses in Lincoln Park, in the Gold Coast, in Winnetka, with fireplaces crackling and a glass of wine in hand. Their cars sat in heated garages. Their children slept in soft beds. And Brielle would walk straight into a snowstorm, 6 blocks to the night bus stop, because she didn't have money for a taxi, praying the last bus hadn't already come and gone. The elevator stopped at the lobby. The doors slid open, and the grand entrance of Thornton Tower spread out before her. The polished marble floor reflected the lights overhead. The dark brown leather sofas still sat in perfect order. The reception desk, made of deep walnut, was empty, no one on duty. The night security guard was nowhere to be seen, probably making his rounds upstairs. The building felt completely hollow, as if it held nothing but Brielle and the whistle of wind beyond the glass doors. She crossed the lobby, her footsteps echoing off the stone, and headed for the main entrance. Through the thick glass, she could see the storm in full force. Snow fell sideways, almost parallel to the ground, the wind dragging everything into a white spiral. The street was deserted. Not a single car, not a single person. Brielle took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, and reached for the door. She was just about to step outside when she heard it. A sound. Small, fragile, almost swallowed whole by the wind howling outside. Brielle froze with her hand on the glass door, her fingers stiff in midair. She tilted her head and listened. Nothing, only the wind striking the walls, the snow slapping the glass, the low hum of pipes somewhere inside the building. She must have imagined it. 12 hours of non-stop work, a body pushed past its limit, a mind gone dull. Her ears were probably playing tricks on her. Brielle gave a faint shake of her head, drew in a breath, and took one more step toward the door. Then she heard it again, this time, clearer. Not wind, not pipes. It was crying. The cry of a child, weak, desperate, as if the tiny creature making that sound had been crying for a long time and was almost out of strength to cry at all. Gooseflesh rose over Brielle's skin. On her hands, on the back of her neck, down her spine, everything stood on end. She turned and scanned the lobby. Empty. The leather sofas were empty. The reception desk was empty. The hallway leading back to the elevators was empty. Not a soul in sight. But the crying was still there, slipping through the door, tangled in the wind, as thin and fragile as a thread about to snap. It was coming from outside. Brielle let her bag fall onto the polished marble floor without even thinking. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She ran for the main entrance, shoved the heavy glass doors open with both hands, and the snowstorm slammed into her like a wall. The cold wind cut into her cheeks, her throat, driving straight through her thin coat as if it weren't there at all. Snow flew into her eyes and made her squint. Her breath rose in a white cloud and was ripped apart instantly by the wind. But she didn't stop. The crying was louder now, right here, very close, off to the right of the entrance, near the line of massive granite columns at the front of the building. Brielle followed the sound, her worn shoes slipping on the snow-coated steps, and then she saw it. At the base of the second column, tucked into a shadowed corner where the overhang offered a little shelter from the storm, there was a basket. An ordinary wicker basket, like the kind people used for laundry, with a pink blanket draped over it, soaked through with melting snow. The blanket was moving, and from beneath it came that weak, trembling cry. Brielle dropped to her knees in the snow, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the pink blanket and pulled it back. Inside the basket, curled up in a soaked pink velvet sleeper, was a baby girl, so small, maybe 8 or 9 months old, her tiny face pinched tight from crying, her little hands flailing in the freezing air, her whole body shuddering. Her skin was cold. Brielle touched the baby's cheek, and the bite of that chill passed into her fingertips and clenched her heart. "Dear God," Brielle whispered. "Dear God." She didn't waste even a second. She slid her hands under the baby's small body, lifted her out of the basket, and pressed her tight against her chest. The baby cried, a thin, quivering sound right beside Brielle's ear, and Brielle could feel how cold she was, how she trembled, how desperately she clung to the only warmth she could find. Brielle shrugged off her coat, the only thing between her and the storm, and wrapped it around the baby. The cold wind immediately sank its teeth into Brielle's shoulders, into her back, cutting through her thin uniform, but she didn't care. She stood, holding the baby close, and ran back into the building. The glass doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off the storm's scream, and the lobby of Thornton Tower wrapped around them in sudden silence. "Is anyone here?" Brielle shouted, her voice echoing through the vast space, bouncing off the high ceiling, the stone walls, the polished floor. "Please help me. Is anyone here?" No one answered. Only her own words returned to her and faded away. The security guard was still nowhere to be found. The building felt empty as a giant box. Brielle carried the baby into the restroom at the far end of the lobby. She turned on the warm water, tested the temperature with her wrist, then dampened paper towels and gently wiped the baby's face, wiping away the melting snow from her forehead, her cheeks, her tiny trembling chin. The baby was still crying, but weaker now, as if the last of her energy was draining out. Brielle peeled off the baby's soaked sleeper, wrapped her in dry paper towels for warmth, then bundled her again in Brielle's own coat. "Easy, sweetheart, easy," she whispered over and over, her voice trembling almost as much as the child's body. "I'm here now. I'm here." The baby began to warm, her crying fading into a small whimper, her eyes squeezed shut, her tiny hand gripping the edge of Brielle's uniform as if afraid Brielle would disappear. Then, as Brielle straightened the soaked pink blanket, she saw it, a scrap of paper, pinned to the corner of the blanket with a safety pin. The paper was nearly falling apart from the wet, the ink blurred, but a few words were still readable if you looked closely. Brielle's hands shook as she unpinned it and held it up to her eyes. "I can't do this anymore. Please forgive me." 7 words. Only 7 words, scribbled in a hurry in ballpoint pen on a piece of notebook paper. But they said everything. Someone had brought this baby here. Someone had placed her in the basket, pulled the pink blanket over her, pinned the note, and walked away into the snowstorm. Someone had left her alone in the coldest night of the Chicago winter, at the door of a building where they hoped someone would find her. Or maybe they hoped for nothing at all. Brielle fumbled her old phone out of her pocket with trembling fingers. She needed to call the police. She needed to call an ambulance. She needed someone to come here and help her because she didn't know what to do. She was only a janitor, not a doctor. She had only studied nursing for 2 years before life forced her to quit. Then the baby stopped crying. Abruptly. Completely. No more whimpering. No more sobs. Nothing but silence. And that silence terrified Brielle more than any scream she had ever heard in her life. Brielle pressed her ear to the baby's chest. The heartbeat was still there, small and fast. But the breathing was uneven. Shallow one moment, deeper the next, breaking in little gaps as if that tiny body were fighting with everything it had just to keep each breath going. The baby's eyes stayed tightly shut, her lips parted, and now and then a weak moan slipped out and vanished. Brielle held her closer, helplessness flooding her chest like rising water. She needed help. She needed someone right now, this very second. Not 5 minutes from now, not 10, but immediately. She was trying to tap 911 on her old phone with fingers shaking so badly she couldn't even hit the right keys when she heard another sound drifting across the lobby, the familiar hiss of an elevator in motion. Someone was coming down. Brielle carried the baby out of the restroom and hurried across the lobby toward the elevator doors, her wet shoes skidding on the polished marble, but she didn't care. She only needed someone, anyone, a guard, a staff member, any human being who could help her call an ambulance. The floor indicator above the elevator counted down, 10, 7, 5, 3. Then the doors opened, and the man who stepped out was not security. He was at least 6'1", broad-shouldered, his frame cut cleanly into a perfect black suit, without a single crease, as if he had just stepped off a magazine cover, even though it was nearly midnight. Black hair, slightly long, slicked neatly back, but a few strands had fallen across his forehead, as if he had dragged his hand through it too many times tonight. A hard, angular face with a sharp jawline, and gray eyes cold as steel, the kind of eyes that made people instinctively lower their heads or take a step back. But tonight, those eyes were not cold. They were red, exhausted, and filled with something Brielle recognized at once, because she had seen it in her own reflection far too many times. Desperation. He was on the phone, striding out of the elevator in long, urgent steps, his voice carrying through the empty lobby. It wasn't an ordinary voice. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders, used to being obeyed, used to controlling everything around him. But tonight, that voice trembled. "I don't care if you have to turn the whole city upside down, Barrett. Every alley, every hotel, every station. Find her. That's my daughter. Rosalie. My little Rosalie." His voice caught on the last 2 words. The hand not holding the phone clenched into a fist, opened, clenched again, as if he didn't know what to do with hands that had always held power but could not hold the one thing he needed now. Then he saw Brielle. They stood about 10 steps apart in the wide lobby. In a fraction of a second, his gaze swept her from head to toe. The wet shoes, the janitor uniform, the hair blown wild and soaked with snow, and the bundle in her arms. The bundle moved. The bundle released a small, weak moan, barely more than breath, but loud enough to cut through the midnight silence of Thornton Tower. The man went perfectly still. The phone slipped from his hand and hit the marble floor, the screen shattering into a spider web, the crack ringing out like a gunshot in the empty space. He didn't look down. His eyes locked on the bundle in Brielle's arms. Then he moved toward her. 1 step, 2. And then he ran. That powerful, towering man ran across the lobby, his polished shoes striking the marble like a rapid drumbeat, and when he reached Brielle, he didn't stop. He dropped. Both knees hit the floor, right in front of her. Right at her feet, his hands lifted, trembling, reaching toward the bundle. Brielle instinctively leaned down so he could see. She eased the coat aside, revealing the tiny face within, eyes closed, lips parted, skin no longer icy but still pale. Rosalie, he whispered the name like a prayer. Then his whole body shook. His broad shoulders began to tremble, his jaw clenched hard, and from those steel-gray eyes, tears spilled over. Not silent, not restrained. This man cried as if something inside him had just broken open, as if for 3 days he had packed every fear, every desperate thought, every worst-case ending into a locked box in his chest, and that box had finally exploded. He bent forward, his forehead nearly touching the bundle in Brielle's arms, and he sobbed. Brielle stood there with the baby in her arms and a man on his knees at her feet, and she realized what she was witnessing. She knew who he was. Not because she had ever met him, because in 3.5 years of cleaning here, she had never once seen him in the flesh. But she knew the name. Who worked in Thornton Tower and didn't know that name? Silas Thornton, the owner of this entire building, the owner of Thornton Industries. But that was only what showed above the surface. Underneath, in the whispered stories traded by security guards during shift change, in the quick way people looked away when someone accidentally spoke his name, in the way an entire underground parking level was cleared every time his black Maybach appeared, Brielle had pieced the picture together. Silas Thornton wasn't just a businessman. He controlled half of Chicago. He was the name people only dared to say in a murmur. He was the shadow both police and politicians took care not to touch. And that man, the most dangerous man in the city, was kneeling on the marble floor in the lobby of his own building, crying like a child in front of a night shift janitor holding his daughter in her arms. Brielle didn't know where life would take her after tonight. She didn't know that the baby in her hands, the man at her feet, and the crumpled note in her pocket would pull her into a world completely different from everything she had ever known. She only knew that right now, in an empty lobby on a night of snow and wind, the line between the powerful and the invisible had been erased, and Brielle Hawkins's life would never be the same again. Brielle was the first to steady herself. She looked down at Silas Thornton still kneeling on the floor, tears sliding over his hard, angled face, his trembling hands touching his daughter's cheek through the coat wrapped around her, and she spoke in the calmest voice she could force out right now. She needs a hospital, right now. Silas lifted his head to look at her. His eyes were bloodshot, but Brielle's words hit him like a slap and dragged him back into the real world. He stood, wiped his face with the back of his hand, and in a single instant, the posture of a man used to controlling everything returned. He picked up the phone with the shattered screen from the marble and dialed one number. Patrick, get the car to the front entrance. 30 seconds. His voice didn't tremble anymore. It was an order, cold, clipped, with no room for the words please or if you can. He ended the call and turned to Brielle. You're coming with me. Not a question. Not an invitation. A command. Brielle opened her mouth to say she had to go home, that she was only a janitor, that this wasn't her business. But Silas had already turned and was striding toward the main doors, and little Rosalie in her arms gave a small moan, and Brielle's feet followed before her mind could even argue. The moment the front doors opened and the storm rushed in, the headlights of a large black SUV swept across the lobby. The vehicle stopped tight to the steps, precise to the centimeter, and a man in a black suit stepped out of the driver's seat and opened the rear door, almost at the same time. Fast. Exact. Like a machine that had practiced the motion 1,000 times. Patrick, Northwestern Hospital. Call Dr. Sullivan. Tell him to prepare everything for an infant. Emergency condition, Silas said as he climbed in, then turned back and offered his hand to help Brielle in. She slid onto the back seat, and the world shifted. The SUV interior was unlike anything she had ever sat inside. Cream-colored leather seats so soft it felt like sitting on a cloud, heat rising from beneath her and spreading through her wet work pants, the climate system breathing a gentle warmth through the cabin. A screen mounted behind the front seats, A small, chilled compartment along the side, the scent of new leather mixed with the faint trace of expensive cologne. Brielle sat there in her snow-soaked janitor uniform, hair wild, arms wrapped around a baby bundled in a torn coat, and she had never felt so out of place in her life. Patrick drove straight into the storm. The SUV was heavy but steady, cutting through the snow on the road as if the weather didn't exist. Inside the quiet cabin, there was only the soft hum of the heater fan and Rosalie's faint breathing. Silas sat beside Brielle, his eyes never leaving his daughter, one hand resting gently on the baby's leg through the coat. Silence held for a moment. Then he spoke without turning to look at Brielle. "What's your name?" "Brielle. Brielle Hawkins." "What are you doing in the building at this hour?" "I'm the night janitor at Thornton Tower. 3.5 years. Silas finally turned toward her. Streetlights slid across the window, throwing bands of light and shadow over his face. 3.5 years, he repeated, his voice low and rough. Then a few seconds of silence before he continued, slowly, each word heavy as stone. "Camille, my wife. She disappeared 3 days ago. She took Rosalie with her." He paused, his jaw clenched tight. "After Rosalie was born, Camille changed. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She didn't want to touch the baby. The doctors said she was having postpartum mental health issues. I begged her to see a specialist, but she refused. Said she was fine. Said I was exaggerating." His voice hardened. "I mobilized everyone. Everyone." The way he stressed that word made Brielle understand he wasn't talking only about the police or private detectives. He meant a different kind of force, the kind ordinary people never had the right to use. "We searched the whole city, checked every camera, every station, every airport. Nothing. 3 days. Not a trace. There was a note," Brielle said quietly, pinned to the baby's blanket. "It said, 'I can't do this anymore. Please forgive me.'" Silas ground his teeth, the muscles of his jaw flexing under his skin. He didn't say anything else. He simply closed his eyes, let his head rest against the seat, one hand still on Rosalie's leg, as if he feared that if he lifted it, she would vanish again. Brielle looked out the window, and that was when she noticed. In the outer rearview mirror, behind the SUV, there was another black car, matching their speed, keeping the same distance, following close like a shadow. She glanced at Patrick in the driver's seat, and the driver caught her look through the rearview mirror inside the car. "Escort detail, ma'am," Patrick said calmly, as if he were talking about the weather. Standard. For Brielle, taking 2 buses every day was standard. Eating instant noodles for dinner was standard. Wearing a torn coat in winter was standard. But for the man sitting beside her, standard meant an armored vehicle and an armed escort car running behind them in a blizzard at midnight. Brielle pulled Rosalie tighter against her chest, felt the child's small warmth gradually spreading through the fabric, and for the first time, she truly understood that she had stepped into a completely different world. She was sitting in an armored SUV owned by a Mafia boss, tearing through a Chicago snowstorm, holding his daughter in her arms, and she didn't know whether, when morning came, she would still be Brielle Hawkins from yesterday. The SUV stopped at the emergency entrance of Northwestern Memorial's private hospital wing, and Brielle saw something she had never seen in her life. A medical team of 4 was already waiting outside in the middle of the snowstorm, white coats snapping in the wind, a pediatric emergency gurney ready with heated blankets and blinking monitors. One call. Silas Thornton needed only one call. And in the dead of night, in a blizzard, an entire team stood at attention as if the president were about to arrive. That was power. Not the kind you read about in books or watch in movies, but the kind that lived and breathed, right in front of Brielle's eyes, making her understand that Silas Thornton's world ran by rules completely different from her own. A gray-haired man, about 55, with a stern but steady face, stepped forward and opened the car door. "Mr. Thornton, I'm Dr. Sullivan. I received the information. Let me see the baby." Brielle handed Rosalie to Dr. Sullivan, and in the instant the baby left her arms, Brielle felt a strange emptiness bloom in her chest, as if a piece of warmth had been taken away. Dr. Sullivan did a rapid assessment, hands professional but gentle, then nodded to the team. "Core temperature is low, but she's responding well to stimulation. We need to get her into a warming room immediately and monitor her overnight. Full blood work, respiratory function check, assess dehydration level." He turned to Silas. "Mr. Thornton, she'll receive the best care. I need you to wait outside while we stabilize her." Silas gave a stiff nod, his eyes never leaving Rosalie as the team placed her on the gurney and moved quickly through the double doors into the critical care area. The doors swung shut, and Silas stood there, staring at them as if he could pierce them by force of will. His fists were clenched at his sides, his back rigid, his whole body pulled tight as a wire. Brielle stood a few steps behind him, unsure whether she should stay or go, unsure where she belonged in this scene. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Nearly 1 a.m. In 4 hours, she had to wake up for work. 40 minutes later, Dr. Sullivan pushed through the double doors, pulled off his gloves, and both Brielle and Silas shot up from the waiting room chairs at the same time. "She's stable," Dr. Sullivan said, and Brielle watched Silas's whole body deflate, as if someone had pulled the air out of him after 3 days of holding himself upright. "Her temperature is returning to normal. Mild dehydration and low nutritional markers, which suggest she hasn't been properly cared for over the last few days. But nothing is critical. She's strong, Mr. Thornton. She's a little fighter." Then Dr. Sullivan turned to Brielle and looked at her with a serious expression. "You're the one who found her." "Yes, doctor. You saved this baby's life," he said slowly, emphasizing each word. "With the temperature outside tonight and her condition on arrival, 5 or 10 more minutes and we'd be talking about very serious consequences. You did the right thing. You acted fast, and that made the difference between 2 completely different outcomes." Brielle swallowed, her throat tight. She didn't want to think about the other outcome. She didn't want to imagine if she had left the building 5 minutes earlier, if she had walked faster toward the door and never heard the crying. Dr. Sullivan allowed them to visit after the team finished the necessary procedures. The VIP room on the 3rd floor was spacious, its walls painted a warm white, its large window looking out at the Chicago skyline blurred by the snowstorm. It was nothing like any hospital room Brielle had ever known. When her mother had been hospitalized, she'd been in a public ward with 6 beds, thin curtains as dividers, ventilators humming day and night, the sharp stench of disinfectant everywhere. This room felt more like a 5-star hotel than a hospital. Rosalie lay in a medical bassinet, wrapped in a heated blanket, a tiny pink knit hospital cap on her head, her cheeks rosy again, her breathing even, her chest rising and falling gently. She slept deeply, completely peaceful, as if 2 hours earlier she hadn't been in a basket in the middle of a blizzard with her body temperature falling. Silas walked to the bassinet, slowly, each step light as if he feared the sound of his shoes might wake her. He stood there looking down at Rosalie, and the hard face of Chicago's most powerful mafia boss broke open for the 2nd time that night. He bent, pressed his lips to her forehead, and whispered in a voice Brielle had to strain to hear, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. Never again. I promise. Never again." Tears rolled down his cheeks and fell onto the hospital's white blanket. But he didn't wipe them away, didn't hide them, didn't feel shame. He only stood there, bowed over his daughter's bed, crying the tears of a father who had almost lost his only child. Brielle turned quietly toward the window, walked over, and looked out, giving Silas the private space he needed. The storm still raged outside, but in this room, warm and bright, with the steady beep of the monitor and Rosalie's soft breathing, everything felt peaceful. Brielle thought about her mother, about the nights her mother lay in a public hospital room, her thin hand holding Brielle's, whispering that everything would be okay while they both knew it wouldn't be. She thought about the day her mother died, leaving Brielle with a pile of medical debt and a hollow place in her chest that 5 years hadn't filled. She was sinking into those memories when Silas's voice came from behind her, low and rough. "I owe you my daughter's life, Brielle. There are no words big enough for that debt." Brielle turned back. Silas was standing straight, his eyes still red, but his voice steadier now. She looked at him, the man in an expensive suit standing in a luxurious hospital room, the owner of half the city, and she answered with the simplest truth she had. "I just need her to be okay. That's enough for me." She meant it. She didn't need a reward. She didn't need thanks. She didn't need anything at all. She only needed to know that the baby she had lifted from a basket in the storm tonight would live, would grow up, would be loved. That was enough. Silas looked at her for a long time. A very long time. Not a polite look. Not the look of a boss toward an employee. Not the look of a rich man at a poor woman. It was the look of a man seeing another person for the first time, seeing past the janitor uniform, past the worn shoes, past the snow-soaked hair, and finding the human being underneath. And in the gray eyes of the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, Brielle saw something no one had ever given her in all 27 years of her life, and she didn't know what to call it. As Silas walked her toward the exit, he noticed her shivering and offered her his own heavy cashmere coat. But Brielle gently refused, her pride still intact despite the cold. She just wanted to be home. Close to 3 a.m, the black SUV pulled up in front of an old house on the south side. Brielle looked through the window at her familiar alley, the peeling gray brick walls, the rusted iron awnings, the trash bins lined along the walkway, snow whitening everything but never quite hiding the decay underneath. Her world, only 40 minutes away from the world she had just stepped out of, yet as distant as 2 different planets. Patrick shut off the engine, stepped out, and opened the door for her. "Miss Hawkins," he said, then handed her a small business card. The paper was thick and stiff, a soft ivory color, the letters stamped in crisp gold. Silas Thornton. Beneath it were 3 rows of phone numbers. "Mr. Thornton's private number," Patrick explained. "He said you can call any time, for any reason." Brielle took the card in both hands, feeling as if it weighed more than anything she had ever held, then slipped it into the pocket of her work shirt, thanked Patrick, and stepped out. She walked around to the back of the house, past the small yard crowded with pots of plants dried out by winter, and unlocked her room with a key gone ice cold. Her 12-square-meter room greeted her with the familiar smell of damp and the draft slipping in through the window that never sealed properly. Brielle kicked off her wet shoes, pulled the blanket up, and lay down, but she couldn't close her eyes. The ceiling had a blotch of mold spreading in the corner, a stain she had stared at for thousands of nights, but tonight she didn't see it. She saw only Rosalie's face, her eyes squeezed shut, her tiny hands gripping Brielle's uniform, her skin slowly warming again as Brielle held her to her chest. She remembered the feel of that small hand clinging to her, remembered the faint moan, remembered the moment the crying stopped, and her own heart seemed to stop with it. She lay there until the alarm rang at 5 a.m. 2 hours of sleep. No, not sleep. 2 hours of staring at the ceiling until the alarm screamed. Brielle got up, made instant coffee, changed into her second janitor uniform, the only one still dry, and stepped outside. The snow had stopped, but the cold still cut like a blade. Brielle reached for the hook behind the door by habit, her hand grasping empty air before she remembered. She didn't have a coat anymore. Shivering, she wound her mother's wool scarf twice as tight around her shoulders and stepped out into the biting wind. As she passed the back door of the main house, a familiar voice called out, "Brielle, come in here, child. It's cold as sin." "Mrs." Dorothy Hale stood in the kitchen doorway, her brow furrowed with worry as she looked at Brielle's shivering frame. "You're going out in this weather with nothing but a scarf? You'll catch your death, child." Brielle didn't want to stop, afraid of missing the bus, but Dorothy's look didn't allow refusal. She was ushered into the kitchen, where the smell of toast and melting butter filled the air. Dorothy set a plate of fried eggs and a cup of hot tea in front of her, watching her with sharp, aging eyes. "Tell me," Dorothy said quietly. "You came home very late last night." Brielle told her everything. When she finished, Dorothy reached across the table and squeezed Brielle's hand tightly. "What you did last night, Brielle. Most people wouldn't have the heart for it. You have a soul that's far too kind for your own good, but the world is a better place for it." She didn't need to mention the coat. The way Brielle huddled over her tea, still shivering from the 4-block walk, said enough. Brielle hadn't even found her reply when the small television on the kitchen shelf, the one Dorothy always kept tuned to the morning news, switched to a local segment, and the anchor's voice made them both turn at the same time. "Chicago police are investigating after an infant was found left outside Thornton Tower last night during the snowstorm. The building is owned by businessman Silas Thornton, chief executive officer of Thornton Industries. According to hospital sources, the baby is currently receiving care and is in stable condition. Police have not released an official comment on the identity of the mother." Brielle and Dorothy looked at each other. The outside world already knew. The story was no longer trapped inside the 4 walls of Thornton Tower's lobby. It was spreading, and Brielle felt something tighten in her chest, as if she had been pulled into a current far bigger than her strength. She finished breakfast in a hurry, thanked Dorothy, then ran to the bus stop. The morning shift at the lawyer's house passed in a fog. Her hands mopped the floor, but her mind was somewhere else, in a hospital room on the 3rd floor with a white bassinet and the steady beep of a monitor. Then, around midday, as she wiped the living room windows in the lawyer's house, her phone vibrated. An unknown number. She hesitated for a second, then answered. Brielle, this is Silas Thornton. His voice sounded different in daylight through a phone than it had the night before. Calmer, more controlled, but with a tight thread pulled beneath it. Rosalie just had her final checkup. She's okay. She can be discharged this afternoon. Brielle let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding from the moment she heard his name. I'm so glad. I'm calling because I need to ask you something. He paused for a beat. I need someone to care for Rosalie. Someone I trust. Someone who has already proven they'll do anything for my daughter without being asked. Silence. Brielle stood in the lawyer's living room, a glass cloth in her hand, listening to every word through her old phone, and it felt as if the floor had tilted under her feet. $8,000 a month, full insurance. Will live in my home, with an private room fully furnished next to Rosalie's room. Your only job is to take care of my daughter. $8,000 a month, more than 10 times everything she earned now put together. Enough to pay off her mother's hospital debt in less than a year. Enough to let her think about going back to school. Enough to make it so, for the first time in her life, she wouldn't have to choose between medicine and the electric bill. Brielle, Silas's voice cut through her thoughts. I don't trust anyone else. Not after what happened. Rosalie needs you. One phone call. Just one call in the middle of the day, while she was wiping someone else's windows, and Brielle Hawkins's entire life could split in a completely different direction. Brielle ended the call and stood there in the lawyer's living room, still holding the glass cloth, her mind spinning. $8,000 a month, living in a mansion, caring for Rosalie. Every word of Silas Thornton's offer rang in her head like a bell, but instead of excitement, what rose in her chest was fear. She wasn't a nanny. She had never been trained to care for a child professionally. She was only a janitor, hands used to gripping a mop handle, not mixing formula or taking an infant's temperature. 2 years of nursing school belonged to 5 years ago, and she had dropped out halfway through because she couldn't afford tuition. So whatever knowledge remained in her mind felt like scattered scraps. What if she said yes and did something wrong? What if Rosalie got sick and she didn't know what to do? What if she stepped into that world of luxury and got swallowed whole? Hawkins, the lawyer's voice cracked down from upstairs like a whip, sharp and full of contempt. I'm paying you to clean, not to talk on the phone. Do it again, and don't bother coming back. Brielle swallowed, shoved her phone into her pocket, lowered her head, and said, Yes, ma'am, then turned back to the window. Her hand kept wiping, but her eyes looked through the glass into the wide backyard covered in white snow, and she thought, this is my life. Getting yelled at for taking one phone call, being called by the wrong name for 3 months, being paid $60 for 10 hours of scrubbing, and tomorrow it would start all over again. That afternoon, when her shift ended, Brielle didn't go back to her room. She went straight to Dorothy's kitchen. The old woman was seated at the table, knitting a wool scarf, the small television still running the news, and when she saw Brielle step in with worry written all over her face, she set the needles down, poured a cup of hot tea, and slid it toward her without asking a single question. Brielle told her about Silas's offer. About $8,000. About the mansion. About a private room beside Rosalie's. Then she told her about her fear, that she wasn't good enough, that she didn't have the training, that she didn't belong in that world. Dorothy listened, went quiet for a moment, then placed her hand over Brielle's, and spoke in the kind of voice only someone who had lived 74 years could carry, gentle but solid as stone. You took care of your mama for 2 years when she was sick, Brielle. 2 years you bathed her, fed her, changed her sheets, stayed up at night when she hurt, held her when she cried. Nobody paid you a dime for that, and you never complained. If that isn't a big responsibility, what is? Brielle stayed silent. Dorothy continued. Money doesn't define where you belong, honey. Mansion or rented room, suit or uniform. It doesn't matter. Your heart is what matters. And your heart already proved itself last night, in the blizzard, when you took off the only coat you owned to wrap a stranger's baby. Dorothy squeezed Brielle's hand tighter. That baby needs someone like you. Not a nanny with certificates, but someone willing to love her with a whole heart. And this is your chance too, Brielle. A chance to pay off your debts. A chance to go back to school. A chance to change your life. A chance like this doesn't come twice. Brielle sat in Dorothy's kitchen for a long time, finished the tea, and watched the snow melt slowly outside the window. Then she took out her phone, opened her contacts, and tapped the number she had saved from the ivory card with gold lettering. It rang twice before someone answered. Silas Thornton. I accept. Silence on the other end. Brielle heard an exhale, not the kind that came from exhaustion, but the kind that sounded like a weight had just been lifted off a man's chest. Patrick will pick you up at 9 tomorrow morning. She ended the call. It was done. That night, Brielle returned to her rented room and looked around the 12 square meters she had lived in for 3 years. The mold stain on the ceiling, the window that never sealed, the twin bed that squeaked whenever she turned, the photo of her mother by the bedside. She opened the closet and started packing. It didn't take long. Brielle Hawkins's entire 27 years of life fit into 2 suitcases, one for clothes, one for old books, and her mother's photo. 2 suitcases, that was all. She set them by the door, turned off the light, and lay down on the bed for the last time. Tomorrow morning she would step out of this room, climb into a black SUV, and walk into the world of the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago. And she knew that whatever came next, there would be no way back. The next morning, Brielle woke before the alarm clock had a chance to ring. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the rented room one last time, then stood and folded the blanket and pillow neatly, as if she were still staying here, as if someone might come sleep on this bed tonight, and she wanted them to find it clean. She took her mother's photograph from the bedside table, wiped the dust away with her sleeve, and carefully placed it into her second suitcase. At 7 in the morning, she called the lawyer and said she was quitting. The woman didn't ask why, didn't wish her luck, only said that someone else needed to be sent before Monday, then hung up. Brielle called the management office for Thornton Tower to resign from the night shift. The manager replied, all right, as if she were reporting the weather. 3.5 years, and that was all she got. It was fine. She was used to it. At 8, Brielle pulled her 2 suitcases into Dorothy's kitchen to say goodbye. The old woman stood in the doorway holding a brown paper bag with 2 hot egg sandwiches and a thermos of ginger tea, pressed them into Brielle's hands, then pulled her into a hug. Dorothy was almost a head shorter than Brielle, but her arms were firm and warm, and Brielle closed her eyes, breathing in the smell of butter and the cheap lavender perfume Dorothy always wore, biting her lip hard so she wouldn't cry. Remember where you come from, sweetheart, Dorothy said as she let her go, holding Brielle by the shoulders and looking straight into her eyes. Mansion or rented room? You're still my Brielle. Don't forget that. I won't forget, Brielle whispered. I'll come visit. Of course you will, Dorothy said with a smile that didn't quite reach her reddened eyes. Who's going to eat my egg sandwiches if you don't come back? At exactly 9, the familiar black SUV stopped in front of the house. Patrick stepped out, nodded in greeting, and loaded Brielle's 2 suitcases into the trunk. Inside the vast space, they looked small and out of place, just like Brielle felt. The car pulled away from the south side, and through the window, Brielle watched her old world slip behind her. Gray brick houses pressed together, rusted iron fences, boarded storefronts, empty lots dusted with dirty snow. As they drove north, everything slowly changed. Houses grew farther apart and larger. Yards widened. Cars lining the streets were more expensive. There were more trees. The streets were cleaner. Even the snow looked whiter, as if someone polished it every morning. The SUV turned onto a road shaded by old oak trees, drove a few more minutes, then stopped before a tall black iron gate. Security cameras were mounted on stone pillars, infrared lights blinking softly. Patrick pressed a button on the console. The gate opened without a sound, and they rolled through. To the right of the gate, Brielle saw a small glass room filled with glowing blue monitors showing images from dozens of cameras, and a large man with a close-cropped haircut in a black suit, directing 2 others dressed the same. Brielle recognized him as Barrett, the name Silas had spoken on the phone during the blizzard. That security room didn't look like a guard booth. It looked like a military command center. 2 men in black suits stood along the driveway and nodded as the SUV passed, and Brielle noticed the slight bulge at their hips. She knew what that was. Then the mansion came into view. Brielle had seen beautiful houses before, through bus windows as she rode past Lincoln Park. But the Thornton estate wasn't just beautiful. It was another world. Blue-gray granite covered the facade, 3 stories high with large white-framed windows, a wide stone staircase leading up to an arched porch, gardens stretching on both sides with perfectly trimmed trees even in winter. And farther back, a bronze fountain turned off for the cold, yet still commanding in the snow-covered lawn. The front door opened, and Silas Thornton stepped onto the porch. Brielle almost didn't recognize him. There was no perfect black suit, no blade-sharp coldness. He wore a gray cashmere sweater, dark khaki trousers, light brown leather shoes, and in his arms lay Rosalie, snug in a tiny yellow velvet dress, a daisy headband on her head, cheeks rosy, round eyes taking in the world. Silas walked down the steps, and for the first time since Brielle had met him, he smiled. Not a polite smile, not a controlled one, a real smile that reached his eyes and softened the hard angles of Chicago's most feared man. Brielle, thank you for coming. Behind him stepped a woman around 62, silver hair neatly pinned, dressed in an elegant gray dress, her face kind and her brown eyes warm. This is Margaret, Silas said. She's been our housekeeper for 20 years. She knows everything about this house, and she'll help you settle in. Margaret took Brielle's hands in both of hers, and her smile eased Brielle's nerves for the first time all morning. Welcome home, Brielle. I've heard what you did on the night of the snowstorm. You're a brave girl. Margaret led her inside, and the house swallowed her in luxury. The main hall was as large as a hotel lobby, high ceilings with crystal chandeliers casting warm light, white marble floors veined with gray, a sweeping staircase curling to the second floor with ornate iron railings. Oil paintings lined the walls, fresh flowers sat on console tables, the scent of oak and lilies lingering in the air. Margaret took her upstairs along a wide hallway carpeted thickly and stopped at a white-painted door, Rosalie's room. Inside was a space straight out of a children's design magazine. Soft pink walls, a white oak crib draped with sheer fabric, toys neatly arranged, a rocking chair by the window, a cream-colored rug spread across the floor. Margaret opened the connecting door beside it. And this is your room. Brielle stepped in and froze. The room was 3 times the size of her old rental. A king-size bed with crisp white linens, a thick down comforter, pillows stacked neatly, a walnut wardrobe larger than the bathroom she'd once used. A private bathroom with a tub, a shower, a wide mirror, soft white towels folded in order. A large window looked out over the back garden, where snow-covered rose bushes sleeping through winter. Everything was clean, bright, warm, and completely unreal. Then a small babbling sound came from behind her. Brielle turned and saw Silas standing in the doorway, Rosalie in his arms reaching toward her, tiny hands waving, mouth forming soft, eager sounds asking to be held. Brielle stepped forward and held out her arms. Rosalie leaned toward her, small hands clutching Brielle's collar, cheek pressing against her shoulder, then smiled. A toothless smile, eyes squinting, chubby cheeks flushed pink, and in that moment, all of Brielle's fear melted away. "Hello, little princess," Brielle whispered, one hand supporting Rosalie's back, the other gently stroking the fine, soft hair on her head. She knew she had made the right decision, not because of $8,000, not because of the room 3 times the size of her old one, or the king-size bed, or the bathtub, but because of this child, because of the way Rosalie reached for her, because of the smile on the baby's face when she settled into Brielle's arms, because of the warmth spreading from that small body into her chest, filling a hollow she'd carried for years. The house was beautiful, like something out of a dream, but when Brielle looked out her window, she saw Barrett crossing the garden below with a radio to his ear, eyes scanning every corner, and 2 men in black suits patrolling the far fence. She felt that behind the granite walls, beneath the soft pink paint and crystal lights, this house held secrets she wasn't ready to know. The first week in the Thornton mansion passed like a dream Brielle wasn't sure she had fully woken from. Each morning she opened her eyes on the soft king-size bed, looked around the wide room with sunlight drifting through white sheer curtains, and needed a few seconds to remember where she was. Silas stayed home the entire first week, canceling every meeting and every trip, teaching Brielle every smallest habit Rosalie had. The baby liked her milk warm at exactly 40 degrees. Not a touch more, not a touch less. If it was too hot, she would turn her face away. If it was too cool, she would cry. She napped from 1 to 3 in the afternoon, and she wouldn't close her eyes unless a small white wool blanket rested over her belly. She loved being carried around the garden in the late afternoon, loved looking at the trees, loved listening to birds, and she especially loved when someone sang softly near her ear. Silas explained each detail in a gentle voice. Brielle could hardly believe belonged to the same man she had heard on the phone during the blizzard, ice cold, ordering the city to be turned inside out. What surprised Brielle most was that she was better at this than she had expected. The The 2 years of nursing school she thought were lost to time were still there inside her, waiting, only needing to be awakened. She knew how to take Rosalie's temperature accurately. She could tell when the baby was fussy from gas rather than hunger. She knew how to massage the baby's belly in a slow, clockwise motion to help digestion. She knew how to watch a sleeping infant's breathing. Margaret studied her with a startled look, then nodded with approval, telling Silas that this girl had the hands of a natural caregiver. And Rosalie, as if she remembered that Brielle had been the warmth that pulled her out of the snowstorm, clung to her from the first day. She cried when Brielle was out of the room too long, laughed when she saw her return, and always reached for Brielle whenever anyone else held her. Those days were almost perfect. Almost, because when night fell, the house changed. On the first night, Brielle woke at 2 a.m. to Rosalie's faint moan in her sleep. She went into the baby's room and patted her back until she settled again. And when Brielle returned to her own room, she heard Silas's voice carrying up from downstairs. His voice was cold. Not ordinary cold, but the kind that seemed to freeze the air. The kind of cold that came from giving an order with serious consequences for anyone who failed to obey. Brielle couldn't make out the exact words, only broken fragments drifting up the staircase. But the tone was enough to tell her that Silas Thornton at night was a completely different man from the Silas Thornton she saw during the day, sitting on the playroom rug, building blocks with his daughter. Then other details began to stack up. Stone-faced men came and went in the evenings, always straight into Silas's private office on the ground floor. The door shut tight, never staying longer than 30 minutes. Barrett appeared everywhere, a radio always at his ear, eyes always sweeping, and the bulge at his hip under the suit jacket never absent. Security cameras weren't only at the gate, they were everywhere. In the garden, the hallways, the garage, even on the roof. One night, around the 4th day, Rosalie cried at 3 a.m. for milk. Brielle carried her downstairs to the kitchen, and as she passed the thick oak door of Silas's office, she heard his voice clearly through the crack. "Tell them the North Territory is ours. No negotiation. No concession. If they want to test us, let them test us and see what happens." Brielle froze for 1 second with Rosalie in her arms, then hurried past without looking back. She warmed the bottle, fed the baby, soothed her to sleep, then lay in her own room staring at the ceiling until morning. She didn't ask Silas about what she had heard. She didn't need to. She already knew. Then on the 6th day, everything shifted from hazy to unmistakable, too clear to ignore. That afternoon, the sky was calm. Winter sunlight weak, but enough for Brielle to bundle Rosalie into a small fur coat and carry her into the backyard. Rosalie loved being outside. She babbled happily at the sight of snow glittering on the branches, reaching her tiny hands as if she could catch the late-falling flakes. Brielle was smiling and talking to her when she heard an engine at the gate, not the familiar sound of the family's vehicles. She turned toward the black iron gate and saw a black sedan stop just outside. 2 men in black leather jackets stepped out, and Barrett's security team moved at once. Everything happened fast. Barrett's radio barked, loud enough for Brielle to hear even from more than 20 meters away. Code red. "Get Miss Hawkins and the baby inside. Now." Immediately. A guard appeared at Brielle's side as if he had risen from the ground, one hand placed lightly but firmly on her back, steering her toward the rear doors. "Inside, ma'am. Quickly." Brielle clutched Rosalie tight to her chest, heart pounding, feet moving fast across the lawn, up the back steps, into the house. The door slammed behind her. Margaret stood in the kitchen, her face pale, but her voice steady. "Upstairs, Rosalie's room. Lock the door." Brielle ran up the staircase. Rosalie began to cry, sensing the panic in Brielle's body, and Brielle whispered as she ran, "It's okay. It's okay, little princess. I'm here," even though she didn't know if it was okay at all. She rushed into Rosalie's room, locked the door, sank into the rocking chair, held the baby close, and looked out the window. From the 2nd floor, she could see Barrett and 4 guards standing at the gate, facing the 2 men in leather. There was no shouting, no guns, no violence. But Barrett's body language said everything. He stood tall, shoulders wide, one hand pointed straight at one of the men's faces. And even though Brielle couldn't hear through the glass, she watched the 2 men retreat, climb back into their car, and drive away. Not because they wanted to leave, because they were told to. 30 minutes later, Silas came home. Brielle heard the vehicle, the door shutting, quick footsteps on the stairs, then a knock on Rosalie's door. She opened it and found Silas standing there, face cold as stone, jaw clenched, eyes flicking over Brielle and then Rosalie in her arms, checking, confirming they were safe. "Nothing dangerous," he said. "Just an overzealous business rival. Handled." Brielle met his eyes. She knew he was minimizing it. She knew business rival wasn't the right term, and overzealous wasn't either. But she didn't ask more. Not because she feared the answer, but because she understood there were things in Silas Thornton's world she wasn't ready to touch. That night, after Rosalie fell asleep, Silas knocked on Brielle's door. He sat in the chair by the window, leaning back, eyes on the dark garden where the guards were patrolling, and he told her about Camille. His investigators had found a trace in New York. Camille had stayed in a cheap hotel in Queens for 2 nights, paid cash, then vanished. No credit cards, no phone use, no contact with anyone. "She planned it," Silas said, bitterness in his voice, distracted the guards, shut off her phone, withdrew cash ahead of time. "She knew exactly how to disappear from my surveillance system. That means she's been thinking about it for a long time, not acting on impulse." "Postpartum depression is real, Silas," Brielle said, and she surprised herself with her own voice. Calm, clear, not timid at all. Her brain was sick. She couldn't think clearly. She didn't plan it because she wanted to abandon her baby. She planned it because the illness made her believe Rosalie would be better off without her mother. Silas looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, not with defense, but with the stare of a man hearing a truth no one around him dared to speak. In Silas Thornton's world, people nodded, obeyed, said what he wanted to hear. No one dared to look the Mafia boss in the eye and tell him he was wrong. No one, until Brielle. "You know about this illness?" he asked, his voice softer. "I studied nursing for 2 years, and I cared for my mother for 2 years before she died. Illness isn't a choice. Nobody chooses to have their own mind betray them." Silas said nothing else. He sat there a few more minutes, watching the night through the window, then stood, paused in the doorway, and said, "Thank you, Brielle," in a voice she had never heard anyone use with her, the voice of someone truly grateful. He left, and Brielle sat alone by the window, watching the patrol flashlights sweep across the garden in the dark, and she understood she was living between 2 worlds. One world on the 2nd floor, where there was a child's laughter, a white crib, a pink blanket, warm bottles, and Rosalie's smile each morning when she saw her. Another world on the ground floor, where there were closed office doors, midnight calls, stone-faced men coming and going, and the words "The North Territory is ours" drifting through a crack in the door, and the line between those worlds was thinner than she had ever imagined. The 3rd and 4th weeks passed, and Brielle barely recognized herself anymore. She woke each morning not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to Rosalie's babbling drifting through the connecting door between their rooms, the happy little noises of a baby lying in her crib, kicking her legs and waving her arms, waiting to be picked up. And every morning, the moment Brielle leaned over the crib, and Rosalie saw her, and broke into that toothless smile, tiny hands reaching up to grab her hair, everything else in the world disappeared. There was no fear, no doubt, no downstairs world with closed doors and midnight phone calls. There was only Rosalie, and Brielle, and the morning. They grew so attached that Margaret began to joke that Rosalie had 2 shadows, one on the wall and one named Brielle. The baby cried if Brielle stayed in the shower too long. She laughed when Brielle sang, even though Brielle sang badly. She slept best on Brielle's chest, her ear pressed over Brielle's heartbeat, as if that rhythm were the only lullaby she would accept. And it wasn't only Rosalie who changed. The house changed too. One afternoon, as Brielle was feeding Rosalie her cereal in the kitchen, Margaret washed dishes behind her and spoke as if to herself, her voice light but meaningful. "For 20 years I've lived in this house. I've never seen Mr. Silas this happy. I've never seen him smile as much as he has these past weeks. Even before Rosalie was born, when Camille was still here, he never smiled like this." Brielle didn't answer, pretending to focus on wiping Rosalie's mouth, but she felt the heat rise in her face and knew Margaret noticed. Because the truth was, Brielle had noticed too. She noticed the way Silas watched her when she carried Rosalie through the garden, his gaze lingering a second too long before he looked away when she turned. She noticed the way he found reasons to be near, asking how Rosalie's day had been, even though he had spent the entire morning with her, inviting Brielle to have tea with him after Rosalie fell asleep, telling her about his work and then stopping mid-sentence as if he realized he was sharing more than necessary with his daughter's caregiver. And Brielle, no matter how hard she tried to deny it, began to wait. She waited for the sound of his footsteps on the stairs each night, when he came up to say goodnight to Rosalie. She waited for the moment their eyes met above the white crib, both of them watching the baby sleep, the space between them shrinking until it felt close enough to touch. She waited for the sound of his voice saying, "Good morning, Brielle." Each time she carried Rosalie down to the kitchen for breakfast, warmer than the voice he used with anyone else. But every time she realized she was waiting, she pulled herself back. Employer and employee, a former janitor and a mafia boss, two worlds so far apart that even the universe would struggle to bridge them. If she made a mistake, she would lose everything. Not just her job, but Rosalie, the roof over her head, the new life she had only just begun to build. She had no right to make mistakes. Then that night came. Rosalie fell asleep earlier than usual, exhausted after an afternoon of practicing rolling over on the soft rug, and Brielle laid her in the crib, tucked in the blanket, turned on the nightlight, and stepped into the hallway. She was about to return to her room when she noticed the door to the rooftop slightly ajar, a wash of soft yellow light spilling out, and she heard faint music drifting from above. She climbed the spiral stairs, pushed the door open, and found Silas. He sat in an outdoor chair, a cashmere coat draped loosely over his shoulders, a glass of wine in his hand he had barely touched, his eyes fixed on the Chicago skyline blinking in the winter night. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and instead of looking surprised, he simply shifted over, as if he had known she would come up, as if he had been waiting. "Is Rosalie asleep?" he asked. "She is, sleeping deeply. Sit. It's cold, but there's no wind tonight." Brielle sat in the chair beside him, pulled her sweater sleeves down over her hands, and they sat in silence for a while, watching the distant city lights. Then Silas spoke, his voice low and slow, as if he were weighing every word before letting it go. "I received the divorce papers today, from Camille's lawyer." Brielle turned to look at him. She gave up everything. Custody, visitation, assets, all of it. She just signed her name, no letter, no explanation. She wants to disappear completely. He swirled the dark red liquid in his glass, eyes following its slow circle. "I thought I would be angry. 3 days ago, if I had received those papers, I would have been angry enough to smash everything in the room. But today, I just feel empty." He paused, then continued, his voice softer. "These past weeks, every night when I go up to Rosalie's room to say goodnight, I hear her laugh. She laughs with you, Brielle. That sound is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life. And I realize that real success isn't the deals I sign, or the territory I control, or the money in my accounts. Real success is hearing my daughter laugh, and much of that is because of you." The air between them grew heavy. Brielle felt it, that invisible weight, the space between their chairs shrinking even though neither of them moved. Her heart raced, and she prayed he couldn't hear it. "Brielle," Silas said, and for the first time he spoke her name like that. Not as an employer, not as a commander, but as a man searching for courage. "Do you feel it too? The connection between us? I'm not talking about Rosalie. I'm talking about you and me." Brielle closed her eyes for a second. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to say she had felt it from the first night, from the moment he knelt on the marble floor and cried in front of her, from the first time their eyes met above the white crib, but she opened her eyes and spoke the truth. "Silas, you are my employer. I am your daughter's caregiver. We come from different worlds, and you know that. If this is a mistake, I don't lose a relationship. I lose my job, my home, Rosalie. I don't have the luxury of being wrong." She paused, then added, her voice quieter but no less firm. "And your world is dangerous, Silas. I've seen it. The car at the gate, Barrett escorting me inside, the midnight calls. I don't know if I'm strong enough to live in that world." Silas looked at her, and in his eyes Brielle saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not hurt, but respect. He opened his mouth to speak, but his phone rang in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. "Barrett," he answered, and Brielle watched his entire body change in 2 seconds. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenched, his eyes darkened, the color drained from his face, leaving his skin pale under the rooftop lights. "When?" he said, his voice flat. "Then, what's her condition?" Then, I'm on my way. He ended the call. His hand holding the phone trembled slightly. He turned to Brielle, and she had never seen a face hold so much pain. They found Camille. She's in the hospital. Critical condition. He swallowed. She hurt herself, Brielle. Brielle lifted a hand to her mouth. The note on the pink blanket flashed in her mind. I can't do this anymore. Please forgive me. Now she understood. Now she understood that the note wasn't only about leaving Rosalie behind. It was about everything. Go, Brielle said, her voice steadier than she expected. I'm here with Rosalie. She'll be fine. Go. Silas looked at her for one more second, gratitude in his eyes that he didn't have time to say aloud, then turned, hurried down the stairs, and disappeared. Brielle heard the engine start, tires crunch on gravel, the iron gate opening and closing, then silence. She sat alone on the rooftop, the city of Chicago glittering in the distance, the winter night cutting through her sweater, and she realized something that frightened her more than all the strange cars at the gate, more than all the cold-faced men, more than all the threats of the underworld. She was afraid of losing him. She was afraid of losing Silas Thornton more than she was afraid of his world. And that fear told her that everything she had said to him on the rooftop, every reason she gave, every barrier she built, was true. And also completely meaningless. Silas didn't come home the next day. He didn't come home the day after that, either. For 3 days he vanished from the Thornton estate, as if he had never existed here at all, leaving only short calls each early morning and each late night. His voice over the phone grew more exhausted with each day, rougher, thinner, as if something were grinding him down from the inside. On the first morning call, he said Camille was out of immediate danger and in intensive care, but she would speak only to her doctors, refusing to see him, refusing to see anyone. On the second night call, he asked about Rosalie, listened as Brielle told him how much she ate, how many hours she slept, whether she smiled, then fell silent for a long time before saying, "Thank you," and ending the call. On the third morning call, his voice was nearly a whisper, and Brielle could hear hospital machines beeping behind him as he said the doctors were evaluating Camille's mental state, and it would take more time. Each time the call ended, Brielle stood still for a few seconds, fingers tight around her phone, wanting to call back, wanting to ask if he was okay, if he had eaten, if he had slept, but she didn't. She didn't know what right she had to ask those questions. She was the nanny. Only the nanny. But Brielle didn't let herself drown in waiting. Rosalie needed her, and Brielle poured all her energy into the baby. She kept the house running smoothly, meals on time, naps on time, baths on time, play on time. Margaret began to watch her with open admiration, saying this girl ran the household better than I have in 20 years. Rosalie seemed to feel her father's absence. She fussed more than usual in the evenings, the hours when Silas normally came up to say goodnight, and Brielle had to walk the halls with her longer, sing softer, pat her back more gently, until the baby finally closed her eyes. On the second afternoon, while Rosalie napped, Brielle cleaned the nursery. She pulled the crib away to mop beneath it, shifted the small wooden cabinet that held diapers and supplies, and as the cabinet moved, something dropped to the floor from the narrow gap between the wood and the wall. A small brown leather notebook, about the size of her hand, its corners worn and a coffee stain spread across the cover. Brielle picked it up, opened to the first page, and knew immediately what it was. Rounded handwriting slanted slightly to the right, blue ink, and the first line dated about 7 months earlier. Camille's diary. Brielle shut it at once. This was private. These were the thoughts, feelings, secrets of another woman, a mother lying in a hospital bed, and Brielle had no right to read them. She set the notebook on top of the cabinet and turned back to the floor, but her eyes kept drifting toward it. She thought of Rosalie. She thought of the note pinned to the pink blanket. She thought of Silas saying Camille had mental issues, but no one knew exactly what, because she refused to speak. She thought of Camille in the hospital, willing to talk only to doctors, and how doctors needed every possible piece of information to help her. Brielle finished mopping, stared at the diary for another minute, then picked it up, sat in the rocking chair beside Rosalie's crib, and opened it. She read slowly, page by page, and each page landed like a fist to her chest. The early entries were neat and clear, describing pregnancy, joy, plans for decorating the nursery, love for Silas. But as the weeks went on, the handwriting grew slanted and shaky, the entries shorter, the content darker. Rosalie cried all night. I held her and felt nothing. No love, no tenderness, nothing at all. Only emptiness. I look at her and wonder why I don't feel what other mothers feel. I am the worst mother in the world. Brielle had to stop, close her eyes, breathe, then keep reading. The voices are getting louder. At first they only whispered. I thought I was so tired I was imagining it. But now they are clear. They tell me Rosalie will be better off without me, that I'm hurting her just by being here, that a mother who can't love her child doesn't deserve to be a mother. Brielle's tears fell onto the paper. She wiped them quickly, afraid of smearing the ink. Silas doesn't understand. I tried to tell him, but he said I needed rest. I needed a spa day. I needed vitamins. He doesn't understand this isn't exhaustion. This is something eating me from the inside. No one understands. No one. Brielle closed the diary when she reached the final page, the one Camille wrote 3 days before she disappeared. Only a single line scribbled so badly it was nearly unreadable. Forgive me. She sat in the rocking chair, pressing the diary to her chest, and cried. Not from fear, not from pity. She cried because she understood. 2 years of caring for her mother through cancer had taught her that illness chose no one, cared nothing for whether you were rich or poor, strong or weak, and it could turn the person you loved into someone you barely recognized. Camille wasn't cruel. Camille didn't abandon her child out of selfishness. Camille was sick, terribly sick, sicker than anyone in this house had realized, and she had fought alone in silence until she had no strength left to fight. The nursing knowledge in Brielle's mind began to link the pieces, the voices, the emotional disconnection, the belief that the baby would be better without her mother. This wasn't ordinary postpartum depression. This was postpartum depression with psychosis, a severe condition she had studied in her second-year psychiatry course, the kind that, if missed and untreated, could lead to consequences that could never be taken back. Brielle grabbed paper and pen and started taking notes, writing down every detail she read, matching it against what she still remembered, growing more certain with every line that this information could help Camille's doctors. She didn't wait for Silas to call that night. She picked up the phone and called him immediately. It rang 3 times. Brielle, is Rosalie okay? His worry was immediate. His first reflex always his daughter. Rosalie's fine. She's napping, Brielle said quickly. I'm calling about something else. I found Camille's diary. It fell behind the cabinet in Rosalie's room. Silence on the other end. I read it, Brielle continued, her voice clear and firm. No permission, no apology. Silas, she's sicker than you think. Much sicker. She hears voices telling her Rosalie will be better off without her. She's lost emotional connection to the baby. This isn't ordinary postpartum depression. This could be postpartum depression with psychosis. Tell the doctors she's been hiding symptoms, that she may be hearing things, and that they need to reevaluate everything from the beginning. The silence stretched. Brielle heard Silas's heavy breathing through the phone, then the sound of him swallowing, then his voice, rough and thick, only one sentence. You've helped more than you know, Brielle. She ended the call. She sat in the rocking chair and watched Rosalie sleeping peacefully in her crib, chest rising and falling. And she realized she wasn't only a nanny anymore. She wasn't just caring for Rosalie. She was holding this entire family upright while it threatened to collapse, becoming the center everything clung to so it wouldn't shatter completely. She hadn't chosen this role. It had found her, the way the cry in the blizzard had found her. And just like that night, she didn't run. Late on the 3rd afternoon, Brielle was carrying Rosalie for a walk along the 2nd-floor hallway when she heard the iron gate open and the familiar sound of tires on gravel. She went to the window, looked down, and saw the black SUV stop at the front steps. Patrick opened the door, and Silas stepped out. Brielle's chest tightened at the sight of him. 3 days had taken a man who always looked flawless in a tailored suit and turned him into someone she almost didn't recognize. Dark circles were carved beneath exhausted eyes. 3 days of stubble covered his jaw. His shirt was wrinkled and hanging loose outside his trousers. His hair was a mess, as if he had dragged his hands through it 100 times without once looking in a mirror. He looked like a man who had come through a battle and still didn't know whether he had won or lost. Brielle carried Rosalie down the stairs, and the moment Silas crossed the front door, his eyes found them instantly. That worn-down face transformed completely, not slowly, but in an instant, as if someone flipped a switch, and the first smile in 3 days appeared on his mouth, reaching his eyes, melting the exhaustion for a heartbeat. Rosalie recognized her father. She squirmed in Brielle's arms, tiny arms stretching forward, excited babbling spilling from her mouth, her whole body leaning toward Silas. Brielle stepped closer, and Rosalie launched into her father's arms like a small bird finding its nest. Silas caught her, held her tight against his chest, one hand supporting her back, the other resting on her head, and he closed his eyes. "I missed you both so much," he whispered, and Brielle didn't know whether he meant Rosalie or he meant her too, but the word both sent warmth rushing into her chest. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, eyes wet when she saw Silas. She didn't speak. She only squeezed his hand gently, then went back to the kitchen to cook. That evening became the most ordinary and the most beautiful evening Brielle had lived since she stepped into the Thornton mansion. She and Silas stood together in the kitchen after Margaret had gone to her room, and they cooked in a way no one had planned. Silas boiled pasta because it was the only thing he knew how to make. Brielle made tomato sauce from her mother's recipe. Rosalie sat in her high chair watching them with round eyes, hands slapping the tray with loud little thumps whenever Brielle looked over and smiled at her. They ate at the kitchen table instead of the grand dining room, Rosalie in the middle, sauce on her face, pasta in her hair, and both Brielle and Silas laughed more than they had in the past week combined. After dinner, they bathed the baby. Silas held Rosalie in the small tub, while Brielle poured warm water over her. Rosalie slapped the surface, splashing the bathroom until both of them were soaked, and the baby's laughter rang through the white-tiled room, clear as a bell. Then Brielle rocked Rosalie to sleep in the rocking chair, singing softly the song her mother used to sing, while Silas leaned in the doorway watching them, his gaze so gentle Brielle had to look away, afraid that if she stared too long she wouldn't be able to keep the distance she had drawn for herself. Rosalie fell into deep sleep. Brielle laid her in the crib, tucked in the blanket, turned on the nightlight, and stepped into the hallway. She was about to return to her room when Silas called her. "Brielle, could you come down to the living room? There's something I need to tell you." His voice was different. The warmth of the evening was gone. This was Silas Thornton, the boss, serious, controlled, and with something underneath that Brielle recognized as worry. She went downstairs, entered the living room, and sat on the sofa across from him. Silas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on hers. "While I was at the hospital for 3 days, something happened that Barrett only reported fully to me this afternoon." He paused, jaw tightening. "The Marchetti family. You may not have heard the name, but they control the south side of Chicago. There's been an unspoken agreement between me and them for more than 10 years. The north is mine, the south is theirs, and no one touches the other's territory. But while I was distracted by Camille, Marchetti tested the line." Silas took out his phone, opened a photo, and held it out to Brielle. The picture was taken from far away, slightly blurred, but clear enough for Brielle to recognize. It was her, carrying Rosalie in the backyard. The afternoon Barrett called code red and she was escorted inside. The photo had been taken from outside the fence. "Barrett found this image on the phone of one of the 2 men that day," Silas said, his voice flat, but his eyes were anything but flat. "They burned. They know you're here, Brielle. They know you matter to me." Brielle stared at the photo, at herself and Rosalie framed by someone else's lens from beyond the fence, and cold spread from her spine to her fingertips. "What does matter mean?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Am I a target?" "I won't let anyone touch you or Rosalie," Silas said, each word heavy as steel. "But you need to know the truth. Marchetti hasn't threatened us directly. Not yet. But they're signaling that they know my weakness. And in my world, once someone knows your weakness, they use it." He leaned back, eyes never leaving her. "Brielle, I'll be direct. If you want to leave, I understand completely. I'll pay you enough to get stable. I'll find you a safe place to live in any city you want, under a new identity if necessary. No one will find you, I guarantee it." The living room went quiet. The wall clock ticked. The fireplace crackled. Brielle sat there, the photo in her hand, her own face and Rosalie's captured by a stranger from outside the fence. And she thought about the 12-square-meter room on the south side. She could go back there, or go to another city, start over, safe, invisible, the way she had lived for 27 years before the night of the blizzard, safe and invisible. Then she looked up the stairs toward Rosalie's room on the 2nd floor, where the baby slept in her white crib beneath the wool blanket, tiny hands gripping the teddy bear Brielle had bought her last week. She looked back at Silas, the man across from her, the most powerful figure in half the city, waiting for her answer with eyes that weren't the boss's eyes at all, but the eyes of a man who was afraid she would leave. "I'm not going anywhere," Brielle said. Her voice didn't shake. She surprised herself. "Rosalie needs me." She paused, swallowed, then said the part she knew she shouldn't say and couldn't stop herself from saying. "And you do too." Silas stared at her for a long moment, saying nothing. But in the cold eyes of Chicago's most powerful mafia boss, Brielle saw clearly what he never allowed anyone to see. He was afraid of losing her, and she knew she had just made a decision she couldn't undo. She hadn't only chosen to stay in a house. She had chosen to stay in a world, Silas Thornton's world, with all its light and all its darkness. And she chose with her eyes open, not because she didn't know fear, but because there were things she feared losing more than her own safety. In the days after the night Silas spoke about the Marchetti family, the Thornton mansion changed. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the kind of subtle shifts only someone living inside the house would notice. 2 new guards appeared, stationed at corners of the garden where no one had stood before. Additional security cameras were installed along the western fence, the same side where the hidden photo of Brielle and Rosalie had been taken. Barrett began making his rounds twice each night instead of once, and whenever Brielle wanted to take Rosalie into the yard, at least one guard followed a few steps behind. She was no longer allowed to leave the estate alone. If she needed to buy anything, Patrick drove her and waited outside the store. Her world tightened to the radius of iron fencing and surveillance cameras, and strangely, Brielle wasn't afraid. She wondered if she should be afraid, reminded herself that a normal person would be afraid, but fear didn't arrive. Maybe because she was used to living through things that would break other people. Her mother died when she was 22, died slowly, day by day, and Brielle had watched every day, cared for her every day, held her every day until there was nothing left to hold. Her father left when she was 10 without a single explanation, without a single call, vanishing as if she had never existed. Her brother moved to another state and slowly stopped answering, leaving her alone with debt and a 12-square-meter room. She had survived all of that. The threat from the Marchetti family, no matter how real and dangerous, wasn't more frightening than what she had already endured. Because the truth Brielle realized, as her days became enclosed within the estate, was this. No outside threat was more frightening than loneliness. And here, in this house, with Rosalie in her arms and Silas at the far end of the hallway, she wasn't alone. For the first time in many years, she wasn't alone. Then that night came, about 4 days after the conversation in the living room. Brielle rocked Rosalie to sleep in the rocking chair, humming the lullaby her mother used to sing. The baby lay against Brielle's chest, eyelids growing heavy, breathing slowing, and when she finally slipped into sleep, Brielle rose carefully, laid her in the crib, tucked the white wool blanket around her, and turned on the star-shaped nightlight that scattered soft dots across the ceiling. She stood beside the crib for another moment the way she always did, listening to steady breathing, checking the blanket, making sure the baby's hand wasn't trapped, then turned to leave. That was when she saw Silas in the doorway. She didn't know how long he had been standing there. Maybe since she started singing. He didn't speak. He only stepped inside with quiet care, moved to the opposite side of the crib, and stood there facing Brielle across the white rails, with Rosalie sleeping between them. The nightlight threw small flickering stars across the ceiling and across their faces, gentle as fireflies. The room was quiet, filled only with Rosalie's breathing and the low hum of an air purifier. Silas watched his daughter for a long time, then lifted his eyes to Brielle. "Camille talked," he said, his voice low so he wouldn't wake the baby. "Yesterday, for the first time since she was admitted, she really talked. Not to me, to the doctors, but they were allowed to share it with me." He paused, one hand resting on the crib rail, his fingers brushing Rosalie's tiny hand splayed on the blanket. She apologized. For the first time, she said what was truly happening inside her head. She told them about the voices, about the emptiness when she looked at the baby, about believing Rosalie would be better off without her. She told them everything. Brielle, and the doctor said what you gave them from that diary helped a lot. They changed the entire treatment plan. Different medication, different therapy. Camille is improving. She's improving a lot more than last week. Brielle stood still, her hand gripping the crib rail on her side. Her fingers were only inches from Silas's, the white crib the only barrier between them. "You didn't only save Rosalie in the blizzard, Brielle," Silas said, and his voice carried something heavier than gratitude. deeper than thanks. You're saving Camille too, and you didn't even know it. That diary, your call, your knowledge, it changed everything. The doctor said without that information, they would have kept treating the wrong thing, and the damage could have been irreversible. Brielle swallowed the tightness in her throat. Her eyes burned, but she held herself steady. Silas looked down at Rosalie, then back up at Brielle. Camille sent a message through the doctor, he said. She said, "Be happy. Find someone who can love Rosalie in the way I couldn't." Silence filled the room. The nightlight flickered. Rosalie breathed evenly. 3 days at the hospital, Silas continued, speaking slowly, as if each word had to be weighed and chosen, and he had carried them too long. 3 days sitting on a plastic chair in a hospital hallway, waiting for a doctor to come out with an update, drinking cold coffee, staring at white walls, thinking. I thought a lot, Brielle, and during those 3 days, only 2 faces kept coming to me. Rosalie and you. He held Brielle's gaze across the crib. Before you came, this house had everything money could buy, but it was so empty I avoided coming home. I stayed at the office late, not because I was busy, but because I didn't want to walk into a place where every room reminded me of failure. Failure with Camille, failure with Rosalie, failure as a husband and a father. Then you arrived, and everything changed. You turned an empty house into a family. Not with money, not with a certificate, but with the way you sing Rosalie to sleep every night, the way you wake up before she does to warm her bottle, the way you look me in the eye and say things no one else dares to say. Silas, Brielle started, but he shook his head slightly. Let me finish, because if I don't say it now, I don't know if I'll have the courage to say it again. He drew a slow breath. In my world, Brielle, everything is fake. Loyalty has a price. People are loyal to me for money, for power, for fear. Friendship has conditions. A partner today, an enemy tomorrow. No one stays because of who I am, only because of what I have. And you are the only real thing. You didn't know who I was when you ran into the storm and saved Rosalie. You didn't need money when you took off your only coat to wrap her. You didn't want anything when you told me Camille was sick, not cruel. You are the only real thing in my world of lies, and I don't want to lose that. Brielle's tears fell. She couldn't hold them back anymore, didn't want to. They slid down her cheeks and dropped onto the crib rail, and she let them fall. I'm afraid I'm not good enough for your world, Silas, she whispered. I'm a janitor. I grew up on the South Side. I don't know how to live in a mansion. I don't know how to deal with Marchetti. I don't know how to be the woman beside Silas Thornton. I'm afraid one day you'll look at me and realize I don't belong. Silas walked around the crib. He stopped in front of her. Close. So close she had to tilt her head up because he stood nearly a head taller. He looked down at her with eyes that weren't cold now. They were warm, soft, filled with something Brielle had searched for her whole life without knowing that was what she was searching for. My world isn't worthy of you, Brielle, he said, his voice low and steady, each word landing like a vow. It's not that you aren't good enough for my world. It's that my world doesn't deserve you. But I will change it. For you. For Rosalie. Because for the first time in my life, I have a real reason to change. He didn't speak in vague promises. He spoke in specifics. I will leave the underworld. Not tomorrow, not right now, because it's not that simple. But I will begin. Transfer things. Legalize what can be legalized. Cut each thread one by one. Because of that hidden photo of you and Rosalie in the garden. Because of the code red that day. Because I saw you running into the house with my daughter in your arms and fear on your face. And I promised myself I'd never let that happen again. The 2 most important people in my life deserve a life without shadows. And I will give you that life. Brielle stared at him, tears still on her cheeks. And she believed him. Not the kind of truth a man says to charm someone, but the kind of truth held up by pain, by fear, by 3 days on a plastic hospital chair staring at the consequences of the world he had built. Give me time, Brielle said, her voice small but not weak. I need time. Silas nodded. Then he leaned down slowly, giving her enough time to step back if she wanted, but she didn't. His lips touched her forehead, light and warm, and stayed there for a few seconds in which Brielle closed her eyes and felt the world stop spinning. All the time you need, he whispered against her skin. Then he stepped back, looked at her once more, turned, and left the room, his footsteps quiet on the carpet. The door closed. Brielle stood beside Rosalie's crib, lifted her hand to the spot on her forehead where Silas had kissed her, and she knew she wanted to say yes. She wanted to say yes with her whole heart, but there was one final barrier she had to cross on her own. Not Silas, not Marchetti, not class distance, but herself. A 27-year-old girl from the South Side who had been left behind so many times that she was afraid to believe anyone could stay. Brielle went back to her room, closed the door, and leaned her back against the wood, eyes shut. Her forehead was still warm where Silas's lips had touched her. She stood there for a long time, listening to her heart beating faster than it usually did. Then she opened her eyes and walked to the large mirror on the wall across from the bed. The woman staring back at her looked different from the woman who had entered this house weeks ago. The same brown eyes, the same dark brown hair, the same face. But something had shifted from the inside out. 27 years old. Former night janitor, a former nursing student who had been forced to drop out. The daughter of a mother who was gone and a father who had left. Standing in the mansion of the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, after that man had just kissed her forehead in his daughter's room beneath a star-shaped nightlight. If someone had told Brielle this story 2 months ago, she would have laughed in their face. She turned away from the mirror, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since everything began, she didn't think about asking anyone what to do. She didn't call Dorothy. She didn't wait for Margaret to knock. She didn't look for someone to say, "Tell me what I should do." This time, she decided for herself. She lay back on the bed, eyes on the ceiling, and thought. She thought of her mother. Her mother in those final days in the public hospital, thin hand gripping Brielle's hand. And there was one afternoon Brielle remembered more clearly than any other. Her mother looked at her with eyes that had grown dim, yet still held light deep inside, and she whispered so softly Brielle had to lean close to hear. "Life will give you hard choices, Brielle, and when it does, don't choose because you're afraid. Choose because you love." Back then, Brielle was 22 and she didn't understand. Now she did. She thought of the blizzard night. She hadn't been afraid when she ran into the storm to save Rosalie. Not because she was brave, but because in the instant she heard the cry, her instinct was stronger than fear. She thought of the day she walked into the Thornton mansion with 2 suitcases. She hadn't been afraid. She thought of the afternoon. Barrett shouted code red into his radio, and she ran inside with Rosalie in her arms. She had been afraid then, but she hadn't run away. She thought of the night Silas told her about Marchetti, showed her the hidden photo, said she could leave. She had chosen to stay. Every time life put a hard choice in front of her, she stayed. She faced it. She did what her heart told her was right, even when her mind screamed that it was dangerous. Why would this be different? Why would she let fear of not being good enough, fear of being left, fear of being hurt, stop her now? She had been afraid her whole life. Afraid of poverty, afraid of loneliness, afraid of never being enough, afraid of being forgotten, afraid of being left behind. But she had never let fear stop her from doing what was right. Never. Why now? A soft knock pulled her out of her thoughts. Brielle sat up, opened the door, and found Margaret in the hallway in a gray robe, holding 2 steaming cups of tea. She didn't ask if she could come in. She simply handed Brielle 1 cup and walked inside, settling into the chair by the window as naturally as if she had done this 100 times. "I saw him leave the baby's room just now," Margaret said gently. Not probing, not judging. "And I know what you're thinking, because if I were you, I would think the same." Brielle didn't ask how she knew. Margaret had lived in this house for 20 years. She knew everything without being told. 20 years I've been here, Brielle," Margaret said, gazing out the window where the garden lights spilled into the dark. "I watched Silas grow from a hot-headed boy into a cold man. I watched him marry Camille. I watched him lose Camille. I watched him hold Rosalie for the first time in the hospital and cry. I've seen it all. And I'm telling you this. Not once, in 20 years, have I seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." She turned to Brielle. "And more importantly, I've watched him change. Not a small change, a real change, from the inside. He wants to be better. He wants to be worthy. And he wants that because of you." Margaret didn't say more. She finished her tea, set the cup down, stood, gave Brielle's shoulder a gentle squeeze, then left the room and closed the door behind her. Brielle sat alone, drinking hot tea in silence, watching the wall clock tick past midnight. 1, 2. She didn't sleep. She didn't need sleep. She needed to finish thinking. to let her heart and her mind fight their final battle. And when the clock hands reached 3 in the morning, the battle ended. Her heart won. Brielle set the cup down, stood, opened her door, and walked down the dark hallway to Silas's room at the far end of the second floor. She lifted her hand, hesitated for a single heartbeat, then knocked. 2 light knocks, silence for a few seconds. Then the door opened. Silas stood there in a white shirt with the collar still undone, hair tousled, dark circles under his eyes, but fully awake. He hadn't slept either. He looked at her, not surprised, as if he had been waiting, as if they both knew the night wasn't finished. "I have 4 conditions," Brielle said, her voice calm, clear, steady. 1, you will never ask me to change who I am. I'm Brielle Hawkins from the South Side, and I will always be Brielle Hawkins from the South Side no matter where I live. 2, we go slowly. No rushing. No pressure. I need time to understand all of this. 3, Rosalie is always the first priority. Before me, before you, before anything else. She's already lost too much. And 4, she met his eyes. You say you want to change your world. I need to see you truly do it. Not because I demand it. Because Rosalie deserves to grow up in a life without shadows. She deserves that. Silas stood in the doorway, watching her. And in his eyes, Brielle saw each condition received, weighed, and accepted. Not with reluctance, but with respect. I promise, he said. 2 words, no decoration, no long speech, no explanation. Just 2 words from a man whose promises, in his world, weighed more than contracts, more than law, more than life. Then, Brielle said, and she smiled, the first smile of the night. A smile she felt rise from her mouth to her eyes and spread through her chest like warm sunlight after a long winter. I want to try. Silas stepped forward, wrapped his arms around her, and pulled her against him. Brielle rested her cheek on his shoulder, breathed in the faint trace of his cologne mixed with clean fabric, felt his heart beating fast beneath the shirt, and she closed her eyes. For the first time, in someone else's arms, she wasn't afraid of being left. Tonight, Brielle Hawkins didn't only choose to love a man, she chose to believe people could change. 6 months passed. Winter gave way to spring, and the Thornton estate changed with the weather. The snow melted, revealing the flower beds Margaret had planted the previous fall. Red and yellow tulips pushed up along the gravel path. Cherry blossoms burst open in the eastern corner of the garden. The lawn shifted from white to a lush, vivid green beneath the May sun. The bronze fountain came back to life, its water murmuring through the windows each morning, and sunlight poured into the house so generously that Brielle found herself drawing only the sheer curtains instead of the heavy drapes she had needed in winter. Rosalie was 14 months old now, and she was a tiny storm. She had started walking the month before. Her first steps were from the crib straight into Brielle's arms, wobbly and brave, little legs trembling on the soft rug before she toppled into Brielle's lap, laughing as if falling were the best game in the world. Now she roamed the house, hands gripping the wall, the table legs, the hem of anyone's pants if they happened to be close, and whenever she let go and managed 2 or 3 free steps before dropping down with a soft plop, the entire house clapped as if she had just conquered Mount Everest. She began to talk too. At first the sounds were nonsense, sweet and shapeless, but slowly they formed into real words. Dada was the first. Silas heard it at breakfast. He set his coffee down, stared at his daughter in her high chair pointing at him, chanting Dada Dada Dada, and those eyes lit up in a way Brielle knew she would remember forever. What grew between Brielle and Silas unfolded slowly, exactly as she had demanded the night she knocked on his door at 3 in the morning. No rushing, no pressure, no burning through the stages. In the evenings after Rosalie fell asleep, they ate together in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, because they both preferred the kitchen. It was warmer, more intimate, less ceremonial. Silas talked about work, not the shadow parts, but the light. New projects, buildings going up, expansion plans. Brielle talked about Rosalie, the small moments he missed during the day, the way she practiced rolling, the way she laughed when she spotted the neighbor's dog through the fence, the way she pouted when she wasn't allowed more mashed banana. They talked for hours, about everything and about nothing, and those conversations braided a bond no kiss or confession could ever replace. On weekends, when the weather softened, they pushed Rosalie's stroller through the garden. The guard still followed, but at a greater distance than before. They walked along the gravel path, past the fountain, past the tulips, speaking or simply sharing silence, both equally at ease. Then the first kiss came, and it came in the most ordinary afternoon imaginable. Not on the rooftop beneath starlight, not after some dramatic crisis, but in the kitchen, at 3 p.m, when sunlight streamed through the window and turned the wooden countertop gold. Rosalie was upstairs napping, and Brielle was pouring tea when Silas walked in for water. He stood beside her at the counter, only inches away, and when Brielle turned to hand him a cup, she realized he was looking at her. Not casually, looking as if she were the only thing in the room, in the house, in the entire world. She didn't know who leaned in first. Maybe both of them did, at the same time. Their lips met gently, naturally, as if this had been written for them since the blizzard night and had only been waiting for the right moment to arrive. The kiss was short and soft, tasting of Earl Grey and honey, and when they drew apart, Brielle smiled, Silas smiled, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing to explain. Then came the moment Brielle knew she would carry until the last day of her life. One morning she carried Rosalie down for breakfast, as she always did. Rosalie sat in her high chair. Brielle was mashing banana into oatmeal, and Rosalie looked up at her with wide eyes and spoke clearly, not babbling, not stumbling, clear enough that even Margaret at the sink spun around. "Mama." Brielle froze, spoon in her hand, and everything inside her melted, not as a metaphor. She felt it physically, as if every wall she had built over 27 years, every layer of armor she had worn to survive poverty, loss, loneliness, all of it shattered in a single syllable from a 14-month-old mouth. Rosalie wasn't her biological child. Brielle had not carried her, had not labored to bring her into the world. On paper, she had no rights at all. But Rosalie called her Mama, and in that instant Brielle understood that family wasn't blood, family was choice, and Rosalie had chosen her. Margaret came to her, set a hand on Brielle's shoulder, squeezed gently, said nothing, but her eyes were wet. That night Brielle told Silas, and he held her for a long time, whispering into her hair, "She knows who her mother is." Silas changed too, in a way that was real, not just promised, but visible in daily action. He began selling off the northern assets he referred to in careful language as old operations. Barrett was put in charge of the transition, turning whatever could be legalized into something legal, cutting away what couldn't. Thornton Industries expanded further into commercial real estate and clean energy, and Brielle began to see thick contracts on Silas's desk stamped with the logos of solar companies instead of midnight calls about Northern Territory. One evening, after dinner, as they sat in the backyard, Silas spoke in a calm, steady voice. "It'll take about 2 more years to be completely clean. It can't be faster, because pulling out too abruptly would create a power vacuum and chaos. But I'm moving in the right direction. Every month, a little less. Every month, closer to the world Rosalie deserves." The threat from Marchetti eased as well. Barrett reported that a new agreement had been signed. Boundaries clearer, terms tighter, and both sides had reasons to keep the peace. Security around the estate remained high, but it no longer felt as tense as before. Guards still patrolled, but Brielle could take Rosalie into the garden without someone walking close at her shoulder. Brielle grew in her own way too. Each night after Rosalie fell asleep, she returned to her medical books, pulling thick volumes on nursing, pediatrics, and clinical psychology from Silas's library, sitting on her bed with a pencil in hand, underlining passages as her old knowledge came back faster than she expected. She began to think about returning to school, finishing the nursing degree she had abandoned 5 years earlier, and the thought no longer felt like a distant fantasy. It felt like a real plan. 6 months ago, Brielle Hawkins had been a night janitor living in a 12-square-meter room. Now she sat in a mansion garden beneath spring sunlight, Rosalie in her lap babbling and pointing at tulips. Silas beside them, reading the newspaper but lowering it every few minutes to look at them and smile. Margaret coming out with a tray of fresh lemonade, and life felt almost normal. Normal in a way Brielle had never dared to dream. But inside that nearly perfect picture, one piece still hadn't been set in place. A piece resting in a mental health facility in the Chicago suburbs, healing day by day, nearly ready to meet the family she had left behind on the blizzard night. Everything was getting better, and now it was time to face the last unresolved part. The call from Dr. Sullivan came on a Tuesday morning. While Brielle was feeding Rosalie breakfast, and Silas was reading emails on his phone beside a cup of coffee. He answered, listened for about 2 minutes, said, "I understand," and ended the call. Then he sat in silence for a long time, staring down at the tabletop, his finger tapping softly against the rim of his mug. Brielle didn't ask. She waited. "Camille," he said at last, "the doctor says she has improved enough to see family, and she asked to see all 3 of us. Me, you, and Rosalie." Brielle set the spoon down and looked at Silas, then at Rosalie in her high chair, clapping for more food. Mashed banana smeared around her mouth, completely unaware that the woman who had given birth to her was waiting to meet her at a treatment facility 40 minutes away by car. "When?" Brielle asked. "Saturday." Saturday came faster than Brielle wanted. That morning she dressed Rosalie in the little floral dress Margaret had bought her, combed her hair neatly, clipped in a butterfly barrette, then changed her own outfit 3 times before deciding on a simple white sweater and jeans. She didn't want to look like she was trying, but she didn't want to look like she didn't care, and in the end, she realized she was anxious about meeting the former wife of the man she loved more than she admitted. Patrick drove the SUV away from the estate, through central Chicago, and out to the western suburbs where the buildings thinned and gave way to open fields and old oak trees. The Lakewood Treatment Center sat at the end of a tree-lined road. From the outside, it looked more like a retreat than a hospital. Red brick walls, gray-tiled roof, wide flower gardens, and a small lake with stone benches around it. In the back seat, Silas sat beside Brielle, one hand on his knee, clenching, releasing, clenching again. He stared straight ahead through the windshield, jaw tight, and Brielle realized that Silas Thornton, the man who controlled half of Chicago without flinching, was afraid. She placed her hand over his. He turned to her and took her hand, holding it tight. "I don't know what to say to her," he whispered, low enough that Patrick wouldn't hear. "I should have seen it sooner. I should have listened, instead of telling her to go to a spa." "You didn't know," Brielle said softly. "No one knew. Now they do, and she's getting help. That's what matters." The car stopped. Patrick opened the door. Silas lifted Rosalie into his arms. Brielle walked beside him, and the 3 of them entered the main building through heavy wooden doors. The lobby was bright, with framed artwork on the walls, fresh flowers on the reception desk, and soft music drifting from small speakers. A nurse led them down a long hallway to a common room at the far end of the building, where large glass doors looked out on the garden and the lake. Camille sat on a sofa by the window, facing the view, and when she heard their footsteps, she turned around. Brielle saw her and had to force her face to stay calm. Camille looked nothing like the photograph Brielle had once seen in the mansion's living room. The wedding portrait Margaret had tucked away but Brielle had accidentally glimpsed while organizing a cabinet. In that picture, Camille was slender, with long dark brown hair, sharp collarbones, a sculpted jawline, and large green eyes, the kind of face that seemed born to become an architect or a model. The woman sitting in front of Brielle now had shoulder-length hair, a rounder face from medication, a fuller body, and hands that trembled slightly as she set a cup of water on the table. But her green eyes were clear. That was the first thing Brielle noticed. Eyes that in the diary had been filled with darkness, and voices were clear now. Steady, sad, but lucid. Camille stood. She looked at Silas first, then at Rosalie in his arms, then at Brielle. She didn't cry. She drew a deep breath, grounded herself, and spoke with a courage Brielle could hear in every word. "Thank you for coming. All 3 of you." They sat. Silas placed Rosalie on a soft rug on the floor, and the baby began to crawl and explore, while the 4 of them, 3 adults and 1 child, sat in a sunlit room with warm light pouring through glass. Silence held for a few seconds. Then Camille spoke, eyes on her own hands resting on her lap, fingers twisting together. "I owe everyone an apology. But first, I owe everyone the truth I've hidden for a long time." She lifted her gaze to Silas. "I've been depressed since I was 16, Silas. Since before I met you, before I loved you. I lived with it through high school, through college, through my years as an architect. I was very good at hiding it. I built walls, castles, skyscrapers for other people. But inside I was collapsing, and no one knew." Silas sat rigid, eyes wide, and Brielle could see him processing what he had never known through all their years of marriage. "I thought love would heal me," Camille continued, her voice steady, as if she had rehearsed this moment with her therapist. "When I met you, when I fell in love, I thought, this is it. This will fix me. The biggest mistake of my life. Not because you weren't good, but because I placed a weight on your shoulders you didn't even know you were carrying, and no one can heal someone else with love. Love isn't medicine. She turned to Brielle. And when Rosalie was born, everything shattered. The depression came back 10 times stronger, and with it came things I had never experienced before. The voices. The feeling of being separated from reality. Looking at my baby and feeling nothing, and I was too afraid to say it out loud. Camille dropped her gaze to her hands again. In Silas's world, people have to be strong. The wife of Silas Thornton isn't allowed to be weak, isn't allowed to break, isn't allowed to hear voices in her head telling her her daughter would be better off without her mother. I couldn't admit to anyone that I was falling apart, because I was afraid of being judged, afraid of being called crazy, afraid of losing everything. Rosalie crawled to Brielle's feet, grabbed Brielle's jeans, pulled herself up, wobbling, then climbed into Brielle's lap, arms tight around Brielle's neck, head resting on Brielle's shoulder. She didn't go to Camille. She chose Brielle. Camille watched that moment, and for the first time tears rose in those clear green eyes. But she didn't turn away. She didn't hide. "She's choosing you," Camille said to Brielle, her voice trembling slightly but not breaking. "Yes, the way it should be." She drew a breath. "You are Rosalie's mother, Brielle. Not me. I gave birth to her, but you saved her. I carried her for 9 months, but you loved her every day. I left, and you stayed. A mother isn't the one who gives birth. A mother is the one who stays." Brielle held Rosalie tighter, tears sliding down her cheeks, and she couldn't speak because her throat had closed around a hard knot. Camille wiped her eyes, steadied her breathing, then continued in a calmer voice. "I have a plan. I'll continue treatment here for a few more months. The doctors say I'm doing well, but I need time. After that, I'll move into outpatient care, go back to work in architecture, rebuild my life from the beginning. Not my old life, a new one. A life where I don't have to hide my illness, where I don't have to pretend to be strong." Then she looked at Brielle with an expression Brielle hadn't expected. Not jealousy, not resentment, but gratitude. "I read my diary again," Camille said. "The doctor told me I need to face what I wrote, read it again, understand it again, and forgive myself. That's the hardest part, Brielle. Forgiving myself. But I'm trying." She paused. "Brielle, thank you for finding the diary and getting it to the right person. The doctors said the information in it completely changed the direction of my treatment. Without you, I might still be treated for the wrong thing." When it was time to leave, the three of them stood. Silas stepped toward Camille, and they held each other's gaze for a long moment, an entire history of love, suffering, failure, and forgiveness between them. Silas said quietly, "I'm sorry I didn't understand sooner," and Camille shook her head and said, "Don't. No one needs to apologize anymore. We just need to move forward." Then Camille moved closer to Brielle and Rosalie. The baby still rested in Brielle's arms, looking at Camille with the innocent curiosity of a 14-month-old who didn't understand what was happening. Camille lifted her hand, hesitated for a second, then gently touched Rosalie's tiny hand. Rosalie wrapped her fingers around Camille's for a moment, then let go and turned back to hug Brielle's neck. Camille smiled, a sad but peaceful smile. She lifted her fingers to her lips and blew a kiss toward Rosalie. "Grow up happy, sweetheart," she whispered. On the drive home, Brielle sat in the SUV holding a sleeping Rosalie, Silas's hand wrapped around hers. And for the first 10 minutes, neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Outside the window, suburban fields gave way to Chicago streets, spring sunlight filtering through the clouds, and Brielle felt something settle into place. Not an ending, a healing. All the wounds were beginning to close. Camille's, Silas's, Rosalie's, and her own. And ahead of them, the future opened wide, larger than anything Brielle had ever dared to dream. On the drive back from the Lakewood Treatment Center, late afternoon sunlight slid through the SUV windows and wrapped the three of them in a warm golden glow. Rosalie slept soundly in Brielle's lap, and Silas held Brielle's hand in silence for 10 minutes before he finally spoke. "Life is strange," he said, his voice low, eyes fixed on the glass where Chicago's streets streamed backward. "A year ago I was lost. Lost inside my own home, inside my own marriage, inside the world I built, and then got locked inside. Now I have my daughter, and I have you, and I don't understand how I deserve any of it." Brielle looked at him. at the face she had seen crying on marble floors on the blizzard night, seen turn to ice when he gave orders over the phone, seen break apart when he heard Camille was in the hospital, and seen brighten every time Rosalie laughed. "Life isn't strange, Silas," she said softly. "Sometimes it just lets the right people meet at the right time, and the rest is choice." When they reached the estate, Margaret met them at the door, took a drowsy Rosalie, and carried her upstairs to change. Silas led Brielle into his office on the ground floor, the room Brielle had spent months walking past, watching the oak door stay shut, hearing cold midnight calls behind it, seeing hard-faced men come and go. Now it was filled with late daylight pouring through a tall window. On the mahogany desk, a thick folder lay neatly arranged, and beside it sat a small, dark blue velvet box. Silas handed the folder to Brielle. She opened it, read the first line, and her heart stopped for a beat. An enrollment packet for the University of Chicago, School of Nursing, fall term, student name Brielle Hawkins. And on the tuition line, a red stamp that read, "Paid in full." "You can't," Brielle began, but her voice cracked and she had to stop and breathe because her eyes blurred. "I want you to have your dream," Silas said, his tone calm, but his eyes weren't calm. They were bright, warm, and full of the thing Brielle had learned to name over the past 6 months. "You didn't leave school because you wanted to. You left because you had to. Now things are different. You'll go back, and I'll hire a part-time nanny to help with Rosalie when you're in class. Or I'll do it myself. I've been a father for 14 months now. I think I can handle it." Brielle laughed through tears, hugging the folder to her chest as if she was afraid someone might snatch it away. 5 years earlier, she had walked out of a lecture hall with a bag of belongings and a pile of debt, believing her dream of becoming a nurse had died. Now that dream sat in her hands, with her name on it, with a red stamp that said "Paid in full," and with a man standing in front of her saying he was willing to care for his child himself so she could sit in a classroom again. Then Silas picked up the velvet box. Brielle looked at it, and her heartbeat sped up so hard she was sure he could hear it. He opened the lid, and inside, on dark blue velvet, was a ring. Not a diamond, not an engagement ring. A slim white gold band, set with a small sapphire, clear and blue as a summer sky. "This isn't a proposal," Silas said, and he smiled when he saw Brielle exhale in relief, and then immediately flush because she'd been caught. "This is a promise that one day, when we're both ready, when you graduate, when you're ready, I'll ask you properly. And another promise." He looked straight into her eyes. "When that day comes, my world will be completely clean. No territory. No backroom agreements. No Barrett walking the garden with a gun. You and Rosalie deserve light, Brielle, not darkness. And I'll give you that light, no matter how long it takes." Brielle stared at the sapphire ring resting on velvet, then lifted her gaze to Silas's eyes, and she said what she had been feeling for a long time but had never spoken aloud, what she had kept inside her ribs for months, waiting for the right moment. And this was the moment. "I love you." 3 words. Simple, clean, not ornate, not dramatic, but they held everything. All the sleepless nights, all the fear she'd climbed over, all the choices she'd made. All of it lived inside those 3 words. Silas slid the ring onto her finger, then bent and kissed her. And this kiss was different from the one in the kitchen last month. It wasn't sudden and surprised. It was slow, deliberate, gentle enough that Brielle felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. Then a cry rose from upstairs. "Rosalie." They both stopped, foreheads resting together, and laughed. "Our daughter needs her parents," Brielle said. And the word "our" slipped from her mouth as naturally as breath, with no hesitation, no self-consciousness, as if it had always been there, only waiting to be spoken. They went upstairs, into Rosalie's room, and Rosalie was standing in her crib, hands gripping the rail, cheeks flushed from crying, but she stopped the moment she saw them. Brielle lifted her up. Rosalie wrapped her arms around Brielle's neck, then turned to Silas, reached one tiny hand toward her father, and spoke 2 clear words. "Mama." Then she turned to Silas again. "Dada." The 2 adults stood in the soft pink room under the star-shaped nightlight, looking at each other over the head of the baby, babbling happily in Brielle's arms, and nothing else needed to be said. Brielle carried Rosalie to the window. The afternoon light had faded. The Chicago sky had turned violet and rose, and the first city lights began to flicker in the distance. Silas stood beside her, one arm around her back, one hand resting lightly on Rosalie's head. The sapphire ring on Brielle's finger caught the last edge of sunset. She looked at it, looked at Rosalie in her arms, looked at Silas at her side, looked out toward the garden where the tulips were blooming, and she thought she had found home. Not inside this granite mansion, not in money or power or an armored SUV, but in a small family built from ashes, a family born from a December blizzard night, from a thin, desperate cry in the dark, from a pink blanket and a note asking for forgiveness, from a heart willing to love without needing a reason. Her small act that night, taking off her only coat to wrap a stranger's baby in the storm, hadn't just saved a life. It had saved a future. Rosalie's future. A little girl who would grow up knowing she was loved without conditions. Silas's future. A man who would leave darkness behind to become worthy of light. Camille's future. A woman learning to forgive herself and rebuild her life. And Brielle's own future. A former night janitor from the South Side about to step into a university classroom, a promise ring on her hand, and a family she had never dared to dream of. And that future is ours. The story Crying in the Storm ends here. Thank you for listening all the way to the final moments. Brielle and Silas's story leaves us with lessons that are simple, yet deeply true. Kindness is never meaningless, and even the smallest act can change someone's whole life. Mental illness isn't weakness. It's real, and it deserves understanding and treatment, not judgment. True family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's strangers who choose to love each other and stay through the storm. And people can change, if they find a reason big enough to change. What about you? How did this story land in your heart? Was there a moment that moved you, or made you think of your own life? We would truly love to hear what you felt, because every comment you leave is a powerful reason for us to keep creating stories that carry meaning. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please tap like, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next emotional stories we share each day. Thank you for being with us. We wish everyone watching good health, a peaceful life, and days filled with love and quiet happiness. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.